Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. We will be looking at terrorism today, specifically the definition of terrorism and some of the misconceptions that surround it. So obviously the definition of terrorism is a very hotly debated topic. Even within the field of security studies itself, there is no real widespread consensus among the experts on what exactly the definition should be. Everybody seems to agree, however, that there are two key requirements, right? So these are the two requirements that an act must fulfill in order for us to confidently be able to say, yes, this is an act of terror. The first requirement is that it must have been done to generate fear, to generate terror. And the second is that it must have been done to create some kind of change, either political or social change. Let me give you examples. Let's say I went crazy one day, I pulled out a gun and I shot someone or a bunch of people in broad daylight in the middle of the road because I went crazy. This would not be an act of terror, because while it might create terror and panic and fear among the people, it was not done for a political or social cause. It was done because I went crazy. Similarly, if I was to just stand by the road holding a banner or waving a flag or whatever it was, trying to create social and political change, that would not fall under the definition, the conventional definition of terrorism, because there is no attempt to generate terror. There is no attempt to create fear. So both those requirements have to be fulfilled before something can be classified as an act of terror. The distinction that I wanted to touch on after this is the one between terrorism and insurgency, because I see a lot of people, including the supposed experts in this field, use the two terms interchangeably without any sort of understanding of what the difference is. So let's get into that. You already know what terrorism is over the last 2 minutes of this video. So let me just throw a little more light on what an insurgency is. So an insurgency is when an armed group takes over a piece of your territory and they exercise territorial control in that territory. Sometimes, actually 9 out of 10 times, maybe 99 out of 100 times, insurgent groups tend to use terrorism as a tactic. They resort to acts of terror, which is why the two are used interchangeably, but theoretically they are not the same thing, right? So if you look at the acts of terror that we've seen in Western Europe over the last 10 years, 15 years or so, that's not an insurgency, that is terrorism. They are seemingly random acts where individuals or small groups who have melded into the civilian community there tend to sort of come out and commit acts of terror. It could be knifings, shootings, bomb blasts, running people over with a truck, all of that. But we wouldn't really say that Al-Qaeda, for instance, has actual territorial control in Western Europe with their own flag where they exercise jurisdiction from which these guys come. No, it's terrorism. Look at 9/11, the most famous example of terrorism. Even though the perpetrators received flying lessons at American flying schools and things like that, it's not like once again Al-Qaeda exercised jurisdiction and controlled a portion of the United States. So that would be an act of terror. The 26/11 attacks in India would be an act of terror. Insurgencies are where they actually have control. So the Islamic State controlling portions of Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State until very recently having territorial control over many urban areas in Iraq, for example. That would be an insurgency. The Naxalite movement in India, the LTTE in Sri Lanka, the Rohingya Salvation Army in Myanmar, those would all be examples of insurgencies that then use acts of terror in order to further their own interests. So there's a key distinction there. The third misunderstanding that I'd like to touch on is the difference between state terrorism and non-state terrorism. Because once again, many people seem to be under the impression that terrorism has to be committed by a non-state actor. This is not true. While most terror organizations and insurgent groups even that we see today might function that way, this is not necessarily true. Because if you look at many particularly militaristic dictatorships, military dictatorships, many of those states commit state terrorism as well. The use of some act of violence in order to create terror for a political or a social purpose. States can do that as well. And if we look at many regimes over the world, usually associated with dictators who either met a violent end or who were embroiled in a civil war of some kind in their own countries, there will be allegations of state terrorism with many of their stories. There can also be state-sponsored terrorism, where a state sponsors terrorism in another country across the borders. So if you look at India and Pakistan, India accuses Pakistan of funding and encouraging cross-border terrorism into India, right? And Pakistan alleges that India funds and sort of helps terrorism in the Baloch province in Pakistan. So there are many countries around the world today that accuse each other of funding proxy actors. And this is quite common. In the Cold War, it was a common practice to use insurgents who then resort to terrorism at the behest of some foreign power in order to neutralize their rivals, right? I mean, we can go into Vietnam and Afghanistan and all that. I'm sure most of you are familiar with those examples. So that's basically what I want to touch on in this 7-minute lecture, guys. I wanted to run us through the two clear requirements for something to be called an act of terror. I wanted us to be clear on the difference between terrorism and insurgency, and understand that while the two might be while there might be a lot of crossover in a Venn diagram that we make, they are not the same thing. And finally, that terrorism does not simply have to be done by non-state actors. Please like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Thank you, and I'll see you guys next time.